If you've ever thought to yourself for the longest time, I would love to learn to sew my own clothes, but you just haven't yet. Maybe you actually have a sewing machine that is still in the box because you're too scared to take it out of that box. Or maybe you have started sewing a little bit, but want to take it seriously and really learn how to create the clothes that you want. This video is for you. What's better than the start of a new year to actually start a new hobby and get into it and take charge to say, yes, I want to learn to sew and make my own clothes. This video, I'm going to take you step by step on like the stages and the steps on how to actually get started sewing, as in the process, the steps you should take from the very, very, very beginning of starting to learn to sew your own clothes. It's in 4 easy steps, and I'll also go through the biggest tips that you want to avoid as a beginner sewer as well. Welcome, my new sewing friends, welcome. My name is Evelyn Wood. If we're meeting for the first time, hello. And I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com. And this here is part of a 3-part series that we're going to start. It's the start of a new year, and I know lots of people want to get started sewing their clothes, but often plagued with like, how do I get started? I'm too terrified of my sewing machine. I have no idea what fabrics to choose, and I have no idea what patterns, and I can't even sew a straight line yet. And it looks really complicated, right? All these things, we're covering all of them. How to actually get started, giving you a plan. This one is about making a quick plan to get started sewing. Like, how do you start using your machine, the tools, the fabric, and just like get started sewing, and the beginner tips to avoid. The next one, we'll talk about all the assumed knowledge of sewing. So what sewing patterns don't tell you, what all the sewing books don't tell you, and what to do instead, right? So all the things missing, that assumed knowledge. And the third part will be about, well, the holy grail, how to start getting a better fit because we're making clothes, and fitting is a whole nother skill, and we'll get to that later. So 3 parts we have here. To begin, I have 4 easy steps on to get started sewing. Do this, do this, do this, right? I wish that I had this knowledge when I was starting to learn to sew. I've been sewing pretty much my whole life now, but now I teach thousands of people online at Vintage Sewing School, and I see this in their journey as well. And laying it out in order is so helpful to give you that vision of like, where should you actually go? Where should you get started? So each of these things I'm going to talk about are entire topics of themselves, and they all, like, I've made videos, many videos on each of these topics, and I dive deep on lots of these. So there is going to be so many videos linked down below, so you can pick which ones you need to learn more of and go and watch those videos as well. These 4 things I have for you are these stages, are things that you come back to as you learn. So one of the ways I teach is always layering skills, right? So take sewing a simple straight line. You can do that like, you know, like this is a beginner, and you can do this as advanced where you have no pins, no nothing, and, you know, one-handed with behind your hand tied behind your back. Not quite, but you know what I mean. You get to layer these skills because everything, all the other more advanced stuff you want to do is all built on these basic core skills. And the more you come back to it, enhances your sewing experience and the results that you get. We recently talked about going back to basics and how helpful it is at every level that you have. So don't think that, you know, once you're done with this video, you don't come back here. You come here as a beginner, and then I've got the next level layering these stages on for you as well. So it's a little bit for everyone here, whether you're learning for the first time or relearning and maybe filling in some gaps and enhancing what you already know. Okay, I'm also going to give you homework, so be prepared. The first stage that you want to do in your learning to sew journey is really kind of obvious, I guess, but learning your machine. I say obviously because, yeah, like, I know how to do my machine, right? There is more to it than you think. And the better that you learn to use your tools of your craft, the better you're going to be at that craft. So there's a lot of secret things about your sewing machine. You know, you thread it, the bobbin, that sort of thing, but lots of things that you don't know as a beginner, like you've got to choose different needles, and you need to change your needle when it gets blunt, right? There are different needle sizes for different fabrics. I've got videos on those, all linked down below on these individual topics, as I said, so don't worry. Links in the description box for needle types, for example. And you also need to clean your machine. Maintenance is a thing. If it gets dirty and messed up, if you're wondering why it's like jamming all the time, it might be that it needs cleaning. The other point, just mastering, not getting thread jam is huge, right? You know, when it all turns into a big thread nest, this is what you focus on. Learn your machine, learn what all the stitches do, learn how to use it, learn how to sew straight, learn how to sew curved, learn how you can go fast, slow, the different needles you need, all the different stitches. Really learn it really well. And when you take this to the next level, you learn that there are different sewing feet and they all have different functions that can be really useful in your sewing to get you better results. The different stitches actually are helpful for function, because you might just do a regular zigzag, whereas you could choose an overcasting stitch to finish your seams and things like this. Mastering, and how the big one for me actually is how you maneuver and manipulate the fabric under the machine. You can never you are forever mastering that as a sewist. That is like number one skill. And imagine doing all these like zips and shirring and all sorts of collars and things all come on this, being able to sew nice, straight, neat seams, right? It all builds on those basics. So really learn your machine is stage one. The next stage, of course, is the tools, because who doesn't love good sewing tools and gadgets? I certainly do. I have probably one of everything I could possibly think of, and probably more than one. But it didn't start out that way, and I certainly don't need all of these things to sew. When you first start, I highly recommend that you go out and get everything, and even with your machine, just keep it really simple and basic. You don't need much to get started with. A good pair of scissors for fabric, something nice and sharp, is probably the only thing that you might need to buy. You'll need maybe some little tiny snips by your machine and some marking equipment, so some things to mark out your fabrics, a tape measure, and there's not much else that you really need to get started. And particularly as you'll see the different projects you work on, to begin with, you don't need much. There are lots of lovely tools to upgrade to that will make your life so much better and easier, of course. And I have videos on all of these different tools that you can get, but just keep it simple. Don't let not having tools and equipment be a barrier that stops you from getting started, right? And so as you increase your skills, you come back and you get more tools, you get better tools and different tools that suit the sewing that you're doing and your needs and likes and what helps you get better results. So you can keep layering all of those tools and equipment, but just using a basic toolkit to get started with. Okay, the next stage is choosing fabric. This is a bit of a rabbit hole minefield type of topic, but let's try and keep it nice and simple for you. So this is how we choose fabric, right? Tell me if I'm right. Is that we see something and you think, ooh, look at this. This is so pretty. I mean, look at this. Is this like stretch velvet or sequins or something like this? And you get all excited thinking how glorious this gorgeous fabric is, and you're going to make this amazing thing out of it. And you soon realize that that fabric is evil and it should not exist because it turned into a total disaster. Right? So choosing fabric is a really important skill to learn. Now, very beginner, basic, this is really easy. Just go and get some nice 100% cotton woven, so non-stretch, i.e. this is something like quilting cotton. We all can go to the store and know what kind of quilting cotton is. It's not too heavy, it's not too thick, it's not too thin. It's just a nice in the middle. It's non-stretch. Cotton is delightful to sew with. It's really easy. It'll make your sewing learning journey so much easier. When you choose something difficult like stretch or like furry fuzzy velvet or sequins or anything like slippery and slinky, it's having a difficult fabric. Every fabric has a skill level attached to it, and it's just harder to work with that fabric. So you don't want to start with the bench up here with a really difficult fabric whilst you're learning to sew a straight line. Just use fabric scissors and cut stuff out. How to pin fabric, how to sew around a curve, all that's hard enough. One thing, don't add a difficult fabric on top. So keep it really simple. I like in quilting cotton to level 0, 0. Then you can focus on learning using patterns, cutting out fabric, sewing straight, sewing curves, actual putting pins in things, measuring. Just learn all that stuff. You don't have to worry about a difficult fabric as well. But that's how you advance your skills. So as you do get better and you master all of those other things, right? Sewing straight lines and getting them neat and maneuvering the fabric under the machine, pinning nice, then you upgrade to a different type of fabric, maybe something a little bit slipperier, a little bit slinkier. And because you have those core skills already, that difficult fabric isn't as difficult as it seems anymore. So one note very quickly is that knits, and that is that stretchy fabric, they require a different set of needles and a whole different set of stitches, i.e. you can't just do your straight regular straight stitch on your machine because they will break. They require, like stretch fabrics, knits, require different stitches and different everything. So that's why they are in a different category and they're harder. It's more that you need, like harder, you need to know that you're going in for that challenge. And I think that's the key. It's always good to challenge yourself with difficult fabrics, but you need to know that ahead of time because like I said, we often just dive in thinking this is fantastic. The stretch velvet looks wonderful. I'm going to sew with it. And we don't know that it's difficult. And then we try and do the regular straight machine, like stitches on it and it's breaking and we can't sew it and it's all stretched and we don't know why and it turns into a huge disaster and I don't want you to quit at that point. So keep your fabric nice and simple to begin with and slowly add in thinking of a difficult fabric as a different skill level in itself, like a different skill that you're learning is that difficult fabric. But a hot tip on the quilting cotton is that you can use thrifted bed sheets, work wonders, absolutely amazing for nice, cheap, secondhand, good, like works great. So you don't have to go out and buy fabric, just use like thrifted bed sheets. Number one hot tip. Now the next stage, you are ready to start taking on your first projects. So I highly recommend for beginners to just start with a simple non-garment project, like a bag, say for example, that I have the 1920s bag inside Vintage Sewing School. Something non-garment because sewing is really two skills. One is sewing, like it's using a machine, sewing, cutting fabric, all that thing. And then the other skill is fitting, and you don't want to have to fit and like choose sizes just yet. Just focus on getting used to sewing at your machine, cutting out pieces of patterns and putting them together and just pinning, get used to that. On a quick, simple project like a bag, won't take you so long to make so you can see some results and like get some satisfaction, right? You got to get that momentum going. When you start a big garment project, it can take a long time and it can be very dissatisfying if you're just starting and you kind of want to see something, you know, for all that hard work that you've done. So I definitely recommend a nice non-garment project to start with and then move on to something, say, loose fit. Definitely for garments when you come there. Something looser fit because you don't want it too tight to see all the mistakes is really handy and really simple designs. But we'll cover that more as coming up and I have made other videos on those as well. Now, if you're thinking like, that's great, I know my machine and the tools, but you didn't tell me what specifically they all are and how to like thread my machine and all that stuff, aren't I supposed to know that stuff? Yes, you are, of course. But here's the thing, I have already made the best resource for you on how to thread your machine, get your bobbin spools, what your whole machine is, different types of fabric, how to actually sew fabric, back stitching, seam allowances, all of that stuff and all the tools that you need in my beginner crash course at Vintage Sewing School. It's all there step by step by step. It is free. I've kept it forever free because I always want everyone to be able to enjoy sewing and get started sewing, right? This is just get started. So it's a free crash course. You absolutely should head over now. Sign up for that. You have 7 days of free access and that is all of that. All of the how of what I've just talked about is all there step by step. Okay, let's talk about the top tips. What mistakes to avoid, because we got those stages, but I'm going to briefly go over these because there's a lot that we often, well, we all make these mistakes and you still will make these mistakes, but by knowing them ahead of time, you can put more thought into it and hopefully avoid some of them or just keep moving on much faster than say I did because I wish someone had told me these things. All right, biggest mistake is choosing the wrong fabric. So we've already talked about fabric, so the choice that you make is so impactful. One, on how easy or difficult it is to sew, and two, for the design of the garment. So every design, every pattern, say, has a fabric that will look good with it, right? And sometimes it's a catch between what your skill level is and what you like want to sew, but it's something that you know where you're headed and you've chosen that fabric for a reason. That's what you're there for. But definitely choosing the wrong fabric, it just can make or break a design. So really put a lot of thought into learning fabrics as you go in. it will pay off in the end. Okay, don't skip pressing or ironing. So ironing is where you're like this with the iron, right? And pressing is where we go up and down. So it's a much more precise, accurate movement. And this is what we do in sewing, we press. Now, trust me, you don't want to skip it. Your garment or anything that you sew will look 10 times better just by pressing it. You don't have to get better at sewing for your garment to look better. You just have to press it or get better at pressing and your garments will look better. I promise. It's like the math doesn't like equal out. It's not like one of those, just trust me. So don't skip the pressing and don't skip seam finishes. So seam finishes are how we finish the raw edges of the fabric because they're sort of like going to fray out, right? And so we need to stop that fraying and it's what we call a finish or a seam finish. And now often a pattern might say, sew your seams together, so right sides together and sew your side seam, and that's it, right? Okay, so this is the secret. What they actually mean is you sew the seam, you finish it, and then you press it. And then you move on to the next step. That is the golden rule of sewing. That's my golden rule of sewing, and I teach all of my students that, that's what that means. So whenever you sew a seam in sewing, you need to finish the edges. You sew that seam first, you finish the edges, and then you press it, either open, closed, doesn't matter, and then you move on to the next step. So decipher what your pattern tells you. That's what it's really telling you to say. So don't skip those things. Practice every step before you do it. So the pattern will not tell you. We all make the mistake of just diving in and doing, say, a zip the first time on the garment in the beautiful fabric that you've got, and it turns out horrible, right? Do a practice one first. Even just practice your stitches, like just sew some samples. I still do this to this day. I will test and practice everything before I do the real thing on the garment, because you don't want the first time you're doing something on your actual garment. You want to test it first, right? It's one of those things that no one really tells you about. No one talks a lot, but it's all done behind the scenes and you need to know about this because you should be doing that. Don't skip it. You will absolutely thank me for practicing all of those little steps first. Don't assume that the sewing pattern is going to tell you everything you need to know to sew up that pattern. So we will cover this more detail next video where we talk about the assumed knowledge of sewing. So there is a lot of stuff, a lot of assumed knowledge in sewing, and the sewing pattern will not tell you every single step, or it will. It's just some convoluted kind of way that it's really difficult to learn from a sewing pattern. They were never designed that way, but we'll leave that for next week. So don't assume that it has every single step and every knowledge. Like I talked about, it might just say, sew the seam, and it goes to the next step. But what it really means is, what's the golden rule? We sew the seam, we finish it, and then we press it, and then we move on, right? So it's the assumed knowledge. One big mistake is make sure that you do use the correct seam allowances with the pattern. So it might be 5/8, might be 3/4, 1.5 centimeters, 1 centimeter. It'll be written on your pattern and it will tell you specifically the seam allowance you need to sew with. The patterns are mathematically worked out so that when they're sewn together, that size turns out the same way. So if you have a 5/8 or a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, but you think, nah, I'm just going to do it smaller because, I don't know, I think it looks better. What you're doing is actually sewing it smaller, and you do that over all of the seams, and your garment will actually end up bigger. And so if you're not getting consistent results with fit or sizing or was it expected, that can be one of the biggest reasons why, is because we're not using the correct seam allowance. So make sure you pay good attention to that. All right, you will make mistakes. It is 100% guaranteed you will make mistakes along your journey. If you just prepare yourself for that, it's easier to just move on. And when you do make those mistakes, they're learning exercises. Just learn from it and move on. You will never end up making mistakes. I still make mistakes now after 25 plus years sewing. It's inevitable. So just don't make a big deal out of it. Just like, okay, what did I learn from it? And just move on is the best mindset to have when it comes to making those mistakes. Sewing is really what I call about the 3 Ps. It is patience, persistence, and practice. So practice, it's a skill. The more you do it, the better you're going to get. It takes persistence to just keep going. Even after those mistakes, just keep going, right? If you give up, then that's the only way that you will end up not doing it, is if you give up. And patience. Be patient with yourself. It takes time to learn and to Like, I know the dream that you have is probably to sew those amazing clothes that you just, like anything that you can think of in your mind, right? You see something, you want to be able to create it. You absolutely can and will get there. It just takes patience, practice, persistence, and building on these core skills. Get these basic stages of sewing and these core skills covered, and everything builds upon this. I promise it'll get easier and easier. Now, your homework is to do those things. Get that sewing machine out of the box. Get your fabric and get started sewing. Join up for my free crash course to learn all those things and get started. I want you to write it down in the comments below. What are you going to work on? What are you going to start doing or improving? Now, remember, next week, or it's in 2 weeks' time, we will be going to the next level where we are taking this to a garment and all the assumed knowledge of sewing. So make sure you practice all of these things that we talked about today so that you're ready for the next stage of sewing your first garment with more quality and attention, and how you can do that. Use the hashtag Sew with Evelyn on social media, because I would love to see your homework, my friends. I would love it. And so stay tuned for next week, because I'm so excited to take this sewing journey with you. All right. Happy sewing, my friends. Bye.